Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. The contemporary discourse on Nigeria is replete with issues surrounding insecurity, militancy, insurgency, and terrorism. As Nigeria has become one of the epicenters of violent extremist and militant attacks since more than a decade, the violent upsurge affecting the country has seen the ISIL-aligned jihadist group Boko Haram at its forefront. Boko Haram insurgency has claimed the lives of some 30,000 people and displaced at least 2.1 million. Vulnerable groups including women, children, racial and ethnic minorities, migrants and non-citizens, refugees, indigenous people, and those living in extreme poverty continue to bear the most disproportionate burden of Boko Haram terrorism. Since Muhammad Yusuf traveled the northeast and later also the northwest of Nigeria, giving lectures and calling the youth to preparation for jihad, the group has become responsible for the recruitment and use of 8,000 boys and girls in cross-border operations between Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. This terrorism and crime trend has become in recent months increasingly systematic, and the risk of exploitation, trafficking, sexual and gender-based violence, and other forms of violence continues to pose a serious threat to children and to regional peace, stability, and development. The plight of children exploited by Boko Haram is complex, multifaceted, and brings into consideration a broad spectrum of human rights challenges. Ultimately, Nigeria has been classified, and I quote, one of the worst countries on earth for a child to grow up, and surviving Boko Haram has become a child quest in Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin. Before introducing our distinguished panelists, a few words in terms of the format. The session is recorded and live streamed on YouTube. It will be further disseminated after the event, and we also look forward to an engaging Q&A session. To ask a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will allow time for our keynote speakers to address questions at the end and urge you to send them throughout the discussion. Our speakers will share their observation and scholarship on trends and strategies of Boko Haram recruitment and use of children, including its rationale, its methods, its ideological and gender dimension, but will also offer insights regarding existing approaches to counter this phenomenon, their viability, as the role that the same children and youth play in preventative efforts. We will open the conversation by hearing from Malik Samuel, a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, followed by Nnamdi Obasi, Senior Advisor on Nigeria at the International Crisis Group, Dr. Subrahmanian, Distinguished Professor at Dartmouth College, and Achaleke Christian, Peace Builder and Executive Director at Local Youth Corner in Cameroon. Without any further delay, I will turn to our first speaker, Malik Samuel, who is a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies with more than a decade of experience working as a journalist, researcher, and conflict analyst. Malik has worked for Leadership Newspaper, the International Center for Investigative Reporting, Doctors Without Borders, and Amnesty International. For the past 6 years, Malik's works has centered on the Boko Haram insurgency and most specifically on evaluating the impact of the Boko Haram crisis on children and the elderly, disengagement, the radicalization, rehabilitation and reintegration, the terrorism and crime nexus, human rights abuses by both security forces and Boko Haram militants, as well as corruption in Nigeria defense sector, among others. Malik, it is truly a pleasure to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Cecilia. And it's a pleasure to be part of this topical discussion and also to be part of such distinguished panelists. My presentation generally looks at the dynamics of child recruitment and use by Boko Haram. That is where Boko Haram gets these children, who these children are, how they are radicalized, their engagement and use, and then we'll look at some recommendations. My discussion is based on research that includes speaking to some of these former child soldiers, former members of the group, and also including women and family members of these children. So when we talk about children recruited and used by Boko Haram, we're referring to orphans, from their parents and to its own children. Boko Haram gets subscription. Sorry, my permission, I'd like to turn off my video, please. Okay, so that should be stable now. So I was talking about how the basic means through which Boko Haram gets these children, which I said it's one, abduction, and then conscription. These are children from communities under the group's control and also communities that they raided, especially in the past. Now, the early years of Boko Haram violence was marked by relentless raids on communities. This was a period when the group practically forced people to join its jihad or be killed. You know, as part of its expansionist agenda, it attacked hundreds of communities, with many of these communities coming directly under its control. People in these conquered territories were considered as Shekau's subjects, and children in such communities were also considered as belonging to the group for the purpose of jihad. There were other communities where Boko Haram attacked, not for the purpose of bringing it under its control due to a number of reasons, including the fear of military attacks. Now, in this instance, they took whatever they needed, including children, and left. Now we look at how these children, the radicalization process. Around 2012 and 2013, when the group was getting to its peak, it had field days, like I mentioned, abducting children, both boys and girls, some as young as 5. So the group established dedicated centers for the purpose of radicalizing and training these young boys into becoming future jihadists. You know, in the early days, when the group had not split, you know, 4 such centers were established, and they were called Darul Quran. All these 3 of these centers were in Sambisa, while 1 was in Alagarno in Damboa local government area of Borno State. You know, but later the Darul Quran in Alagarno was moved to Sambisa. So you had all 4 of these centers based in Sambisa for the boys. After the split in 2016, so ISWAP also set up its own Darul Quran on the island. Now, in this Darul Quran, young boys are essentially brainwashed into accepting and becoming jihadists from an early age. Children are exposed and mandated to recite the Quran, learn about jihad, and engaging in some fitness exercise like jogging, which they were told builds their stamina. Sometimes they are shown war movies. A child is not allowed to play, cry, or even miss his parents openly. This was seen, or are still seen, as sign of weakness. You know, so and from the age of 8, a young boy is taught how to dismantle, assemble, and shoot rifles with animals like dogs and cows used as target object. These are all for boys. Now we look at the radicalization for girls. Both JAS and ISWAP also use female, they also have their own female equivalent of Darul Quran, and these are called Mustadafin. Mustadafin houses unmarried women, widows, divorcees, and young girls from also from the age of 5. JAS has 6 of such centers in Sambisa, while ISWAP has 8. It used to be 1, but then it became 8. We'll come to that later in the discussion. Now, in this Mustadafins, what happens? The girls are kept for the purpose of being married off to Boko Haram members to be used as slaves and also suicide bombers, especially in the case of JAS, because ISWAP does not believe in deploying women in combat roles. Now, once a girl reaches the age of 12, she's expected to get married. Male Boko Haram members come to this Mustadafin to make their choice. A girl is allowed to reject a marriage proposal, but not for long, as she will eventually be forcibly married off or taken to another group. Now, this second group, where women are kept, this second group comprises of women and girls that are kept specifically as suicide bombers. So now let's look at the engagement and use of these children, how Boko Haram uses them. You know, like I mentioned, from the age of 12, a boy that has gone through Darul Quran is considered combat ready and can be deployed to the battlefield. In this places, senior commanders go there to observe the children for the purpose of identifying those with great potential for the group. A commander can select any of the children, any of the young boys, and take them with him. They become his protege, running errands for him, serving as spies or even as bodyguards. Some are also even sent to serve as Shekau's bodyguards, depending on his demands. Now, according to former fighters, in 2015, Darul Quran boys, now just to tell you how much these young boys, these young children are used. In 2015, we remember when the multinational joint task force launched a massive operation against Boko Haram. Now, former fighters stated that these boys were key in pushing back and foiling the military attack when the troops attacked Ukba. Now, Ukba is reportedly where Shekau is based in Sambisa. With the military recording successes in other parts of Sambisa, Shekau for the first time had no choice but to deploy these young boys, primarily as suicide bombers. They were strapped with suicide belts, while some drove in explosive laden vehicles into the midst of troops. You know, there were so many of them that the military had to withdraw. This was considered a major victory for Boko Haram, and most of the credit went, to these young boys. Some of these boys, the Darul Quran boys, they have grown to become influential members and commanders within Boko Haram. Now I'm talking about both JAS and ISWAP. A few of them are even as highly ranked as Qaids. Right now, the information I'm getting is that the ISWAP's current Amiru Jais, which is like the head of defense, is a graduate of the Darul Quran system. Now, let's look at a few of the impact of this on children. One is that these children are exposed to violence. Children, like other members of the communities, are expected to watch punishments like beheading, slaughtering, amputation, lashing, among others, meted out to offenders. These punishments serve as deterrent for onlookers as indication of what will happen to them if they commit the same offense. Another impact on these children is that these children are victims of violence. Here, I mean starvation, physical abuse, sexual violence, and death. Around 2013, 2014, as many as 200 young boys in this Darul Quran in Sambisa died, mainly from hunger. You know, as part of their training, children were expected to be given little food. So this death caused some problems within Boko Haram leadership, with some of the commanders blaming Shekau for not providing enough food for the children. I'm sure people know that during the 2016 split, this issue of children dying in Sambisa was one of the reasons given by the defectors, I mean ISWAP. Now we've talked about boys. Now we'll go to girls. Young girls also experience violence, especially in the form of rape. Now, many of these girls, when they are abducted, on the way when they're taken to Mustadafin, most of them get raped before they're taken to these places. While some are also used as domestic slaves, especially by high-ranking members of the group. And as domestic slaves, they are also regarded as sexual slave or sexual objects, by their masters. The Mustadafins, where these girls are kept, are usually large because of the number of people they accommodate. This makes them very visible from the sky, an easy target of military jet bombings. There was an instance that happened in 2019 on the island. Former fighters reported that, like I mentioned earlier, ISWAP used to have just one Mustadafin. And in this place, there were 800 women and girls. But in 2019, before the Ramadan, there was a military bombing, a jet dropped bombs on this building, which resulted in the deaths of about 120 women and girls, 80 young girls and 40 adults. And after this incident, ISWAP decided not to keep all the women and girls in one place. So it split them in different locations on the island. While women and girls' combat role has been reported only in terms of their deployment as suicide bombers, some young girls were in the past taken to the battlefield, especially before the split. Now we're talking about when everything was under Shekau control. They joined other young boys as members of the cheering party, whose role was boosting fighters' morale by shouting Allahu Akbar. People who are familiar with attacks by Boko Haram will always tell you that when these guys are coming, the first thing you hear apart from gunshot is this shout of Allahu Akbar. So now they many times use young boys and young girls as part of this cheering crowd to boost the morale of fighters. For instance, in 2014, during the attack on the Nigerian Air Force base in Maiduguri, some former fighters reported that women and young girls were part of this team that was deployed to cheer fighters by shouting Allahu Akbar. Now, we've looked at all this for want of time, so I'll just go straight into recommendation. Given the fact that access to Boko Haram or influence over them is almost impossible, it is difficult to make recommendations that will influence them. Rather, recommendations should be aimed at addressing the recruitment drives of the group, which makes it easy to recruit and use children. This is why I like to draw audience attention and refer them to a great policy document put together by the African Union and the Lake Chad Basin Commission with support from development partners, including the UN. This document, called the Regional Strategy for the Stabilization, Recovery and Resilience of the Boko Haram Affected Areas in the Lake Chad Basin region, has 9 pillars of intervention that are aimed at holistically addressing the crisis facing the region. And this includes the issues we are discussing today, which is the use of children. For want of time, I would like to talk about 4 recommendations. Now, there's a need for significant investment in education to be made, especially education for young children. With many children in Borno State out of school, it's easy for violent extremist groups like Boko Haram to better exploit the lack of education and livelihood opportunities in their recruitment. We know for sure education and better livelihood options would not stop abductions, yes, but they will help avoid driving communities, including children, into the arms of violent extremist groups, especially ISWAP, which is seen as providing better opportunities and alternatives to the government. The second recommendation I'd like to make is that the detention of children by the military needs to end. A way out of this is for the Nigerian government or for other countries' government to sign a handover protocol with the UN as part of ending military detention of children, and so as to transfer all children still in military detention to relevant authorities responsible for child protection. It's good to note that people in Boko Haram, including children, are well aware of the military's unlawful detention and the conditions therein. This knowledge prevents them from leaving the group because they are afraid that the same fate awaits them. The third recommendation relates to something that has been done in the past, but which was largely led by the military, and that is to develop radio programs, letter droppings, leaflets, and all that as part of incentivizing defections. This was done in the past, like I mentioned, especially around 2016, 17, and 18. Some former child soldiers said they had such radio programs and saw leaflets, and those played a role in their defections. Maybe some of those programs could include children who had come out of the group and who could speak about the difficulties of their time with the group as a way to encourage defections and also discourage other children from joining. The problem with this approach is that if children keep getting unlawfully detained by the military, it will be difficult for this recommendation to work, because people know that whatever is promised on these radio programs, which is essentially to say you'll be treated well if you leave Boko Haram, may be different from the reality on the ground. The last recommendation I'd like to make relates to community and civil society involvement. The solution to this problem must include participation from local communities and civil society organizations, because one of the major problems we have seen with rehabilitation and reintegration of people associated with Boko Haram is widespread stigmatization. And this largely stems from a lack of involvement of relevant stakeholders like community members and civil society organizations. Now, if community members and CSOs are properly educated, that these children are as much victims as the communities themselves, because these children most of them have lost their childhood. it will go a long way in ensuring good reception for these children and encourage more to leave the group. So I would like to stop here and hand back over to Cecilia while I wait for the Q&A session if there are questions for me.
Thank you so much, Malik. And I think that our next speaker, Mr. Obasi, will further articulate on these dynamics, trends, manifestation, and on the particular strategies and tactics employed by Boko Haram targeting children, as well as the current approaches to counter it. Nnamdi Obasi is a senior advisor on Nigeria at the International Crisis Group, currently leading crisis groups research, policy, prescriptions, and advocacy in the country. In the International Crisis Groups, Obasi has researched and written on a wide range of Nigerian security issues, including militancy and violence in the Niger Delta, Boko Haram insurgency in the Northeast, herder farmer and criminal violence in central and northwestern Nigeria, Shiite government tensions, Biafra separatist agitation, election violence, and military reform. Before joining the International Crisis Group, he has served as a senior research fellow and later head of Department of Peacekeeping and Humanitarian Affairs at the Center for Strategic Studies and Research of the National Defense College in Abuja. Between 1984 and 1994, Obasi has worked as a journalist on the editorial board of Concord newspapers in Lagos, then the largest selling newspapers in sub-Saharan Africa. Obasi has authored 2 books, Ethnic Militias, Vigilantes, and Separatist Groups in Nigeria, and the Small Arms Proliferation and Disarmament in West Africa. He has also contributed chapters to many others, including Margaret Vaught, The Liberian Crisis, and ECOMOG, a bold attempt at regional peacekeeping, and Fueling the World, Failing the Region, Oil Governance and Development in Africa's Gulf of Guinea. He holds a bachelor and a master's degree in demography and social statistics from the Obafemi Awolowo University and a certificate in facilitation of peacekeeping training from the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Accra, Ghana. Mr. Obasi, thank you very much for taking time. We welcome your remarks.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure, and I'm grateful that you are providing an opportunity to discuss this very important subject. It's often overlooked in a lot of the work that is being done about extremist groups. That's the plight of children and how they have been used and abused and impacted by the conflict. So I think this is a very useful discussion. Well, first I would like to say that I think it's pretty common knowledge now that Boko Haram has used children extensively in its operations. And when I say Boko Haram, that includes the 2 armed groups that are referred to collectively as Boko Haram, ISWAP and JAS. The evidence is, quite abundant. As Malik said, from communities where children were recruited or conscripted, we've had stories told from those communities about how children were taken away and then were later found fighting with Boko Haram or serving some of Boko Haram's purposes. We've also had large numbers of children rescued from Boko Haram itself, and we've had their testimonies about how they were used and abused. And we've had the Nigerian military also reporting about its encounters with children during operations. And we've also had Boko Haram itself providing evidence directly by itself, confirming. There was a notorious video that they put out sometime with a range of pictures of children that they were being, that were being trained and indoctrinated in the camps, as Malik explained. So there's ample evidence that this is happening, or this has happened over the years. But then the scale of what has happened, we are not very clear about, because there's been a lack of systematic reporting on missing persons and abductions and so on. We also have limited access to certain areas in which children are held up behind, by the armed groups. It's also not possible accessing like Sambisa Forest, where Abubakar Shekau and his JAS are located, are based. But obviously, really tens of thousands of children must have been used in various capacities. Again, in terms of trends, we are not very clear too about the trends. They were used very much at the beginning of the conflict. And between 2014, 2016, they were particularly used in suicide bombings and so on. And then late last year, the multinational joint task force, the four-nation alliance fighting Boko Haram around Lake Chad, also flagged an alert that it looked like Boko Haram was stepping up child recruitment. So, but we don't have any alternative source of confirming that. But obviously, the group is still using children quite a lot. In terms of the context in which this is happening, again, it goes back to the point Malik made earlier. The northeast of Nigeria is, under very grim economic and social conditions. There's high level of poverty, there's high level of illiteracy, there's high level of unemployment. There is very low human welfare investments. And so lots of children are just vulnerable to being lured into all kinds of groups. And so when Boko Haram, understood that, it served very well that, it had this large army of potential recruits that it could draw in. But then also the group has stated sometimes that it abducted children in retaliation against, particular communities, or in retaliation against the government that had detained, some of their own members or some of their own relatives. Also, in some cases, they said they abducted children as punishment for children who were attending Western-style schools, which they consider immoral and anti-Islam. So there's a whole lot of reasons why they are doing that. But then, as I said, the context is one of extreme economic adversity, very grim social conditions that led to, the abduction of children and the recruitment of children into those groups. I must also add the issue of real or perceived injustice in that environment, in which, people see a certain extreme class differences. A certain class is living quite well and seems in control of the state and its resources, and then others are just scavenging. And that sense of social injustice has been a major selling point for Boko Haram in trying to get young people to join its ranks. We'll look at the modalities by which the children and youths are being recruited. And there are probably about 6 or 7 major ones. The first, as Malik again had earlier said, is the abduction and forcible recruitment. It's been prevalent in Boko Haram's activities over the years. The most publicized case was the case of the Chibok girls in April 2014, but that wasn't even, the abductions have been far, far more than that case. So abduction and forcible recruitment is one. Persuasion is another, especially where the military has carried out operations in which people's rights were violated and some people had their family members killed and so on. Then Boko Haram is able to persuade them that in order to avenge, your family members who were killed, you need to join our ranks, and join us to fight the Nigerian state and the Nigerian military. And there's also the enticement through indoctrination. A number of clerics in that environment who, over the time, had been, preaching the same extremist messages that Yusuf, championed Boko Haram with, and some of them are still around, and the ideology is still, alive. So there are people who are persuaded by that, and they drop out from school or from work and join Boko Haram. There are also cases of people who joined or who were recruited through family ties. We found parents who actually gave up their children to Boko Haram, either because of economic expectations of some economic gain or to obtain security guarantees. There were places where people were told, if your son doesn't join us, then we know that you're an enemy and we'll treat you as one. So some parents actually, some fathers gave up their children to join. There are also cases where children and young people have been drawn in by offers of financial incentives, especially where you have orphans whose families have, all virtually been killed, and they have been in a very hopeless situation. And the only means of survival, as they can see it, is by belonging to the group that guarantees them, some cover. And then finally, there have been issues of peer pressure. Children who have been recruited and indoctrinated, radicalized, and then they reach out to their peers and say, look, we are here and we are, serving the cause of Allah, and you have to join us, and this is the glorious thing to do. And eventually they get sucked in, they get those other members, their peers sucked into the group. So there's a variety of, if you like, entry points from which people are joined. Young people are being recruited or conscripted into the group. In terms of the use of children, they've been used in a variety of ways again, but the most prominent would seem to be that first, they've been used in direct hostilities. We talked about planting improvised explosive devices or burning schools and houses, but there have also been cases where they were deployed directly in the fronts to fight, against the army or the civilian JTF, the vigilante organization that is allied to the army in Borno State. They've also been used in support roles, such as cooks and messengers, but also as lookouts and informants who provide information, to them. And then they've been used as human shields to to protect members of Boko Haram from military operations. In many cases where they were sent ahead, the military sometimes reserved about unleashing force on them as they would if they were adults. So they've been used in such ways as a human shield to protect members of Boko Haram. They've been used as suicide bombers, as I say, predominantly between 2014 and 2016. In fact, over that period, we have a record of a total of 90 children who were killed in 56 suicide attacks. And, curiously or sadly, 70 were girls and 20 were boys. That means the group has used a lot more girls, in suicide operations than it used boys. Of course, finally, is the use of girls as wives, forced wives, and for sexual gratification purposes. What are the existing approaches to countering recruitment and use of children? First of all, there's some efforts to prevent indoctrinations, regulate certain kinds of preaching, encourage communities to be on alert and watch for, individuals who may be trying to recruit members to the group. And then there are also some efforts, some initiatives that have been made by Muslim clerics in developing or providing alternative narratives that counter those of the jihadists. I'll come back to that a little later, as well as use of mass media in trying to provide alternative narratives and moderating dialogue in a way that prevents and tries to limit indoctrination of children by the extremist groups. The second option has also been, the second approach has also been to prevent abductions by securing schools and communities. Hence, there's been more military activity and more military presence in the region over the last several years. And then the third has been the idea of rehabilitating children who are rescued or captured from the armed groups in order to prevent them from returning to the forest and returning to the groups. And here we have their programs that are being run by the Borno State government at a small rehabilitation center for children and women. It's called the Bulunkutu Center. It does some work, but then it's not on the scale of the problem. It doesn't reach the scale of the problem. There are also a number of NGOs that are trying to contributing in that regard. I would readily recall point to the case of the NIM Foundation. It's an NGO that's based in Abuja and Maiduguri in the northeast. And it has a program called the Yellow Ribbon Initiative that tries to provide psychological support, trauma support, moral instructions, peace mentoring, and so on and so forth to children who have been recovered from the armed groups. But then this approach is also, faced with challenges. In terms of protecting communities and schools, it's clear that the Nigerian military doesn't have enough numbers on ground in the Northeast to provide comprehensive protection to schools and communities where children have been abducted from. The governor of the states, of Borno State in the Northeast, actually said, has said repeatedly that the state would need at least 1,000 more troops on ground in order to ensure protection of communities and schools and so on. And as long as there's that deficit, that gap in troops on ground, in boots on ground, it still leaves a lot of room for Boko Haram to attack communities and schools and abduct young people. Second is the continuing indoctrination by extremist narratives and ideologies. That is, as I said, is still continuing. So there is a need to boost the efforts and boost programs for projecting counter narratives. There is a very good initiative by a group of clerics based in Maiduguri, and they produced a document called Moderation in Dialogue, an alternative narrative from Borno. It provides point by point, countering the message from the extremist groups and tries to present a very different and very well-informed narrative that can help to prevent children and young people from being indoctrinated, by Boko Haram. Unfortunately, this initiative is still very limited in terms of its reach. And I think part of what needs to be done for projects like this is to give them much greater support. They need to be more widely publicized. The material needs to be more widely disseminated. And then schools and communities also need to provide forums in which young people can be brought together and exposed to these alternative narratives. Thirdly, is that the social and economic environment that created, the social and economic conditions that created an enabling environment for Boko Haram to recruit over the years is still very much in place. The poverty is still there, the unemployment is still there, the low livelihood indices still very much there. And part of the long-term effort to counter the recruitment of children must be to change that environment, get children to school, get them off the streets, get them, young people, into meaningful employment, meaningful activities. That could go a long way to changing the environment and making it, harder for extremist groups to recruit children. And then finally is the question of, the detention of the children. Sometimes they've been lumped together with, other members of the group, much older members of the group, in very unpleasant, conditions. Sometimes hundreds of them in a cell, sometimes very little food and problem challenges of water and medical care. There have been cases, reports of children being tortured in some of those detention centers, and some of them stay in those detention centers for too long without being properly screened and profiled, and without their cases being determined whether they would be let go and be rehabilitated, or whether they have, also to bear some responsibility and answer questions for atrocities that were committed. So there's a need to speed up that process and ensure that detentions are kept to the barest minimum of time. And once, the children are cleared from those centers, they should be exposed to rehabilitation and reintegration programs that could help them to settle down back into society and not go back to the armed groups. I think I want to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nnamdi, for your invaluable insights and for offering your views on current limitation as well as prospective opportunities to enact effective responses and mitigation efforts to this issue. I am now delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Subrahmanian. Dr. Subrahmanian is a distinguished professor in cybersecurity, technology, and society, and the director of the Institute for Security, Technology, and Society at Dartmouth College. He previously served as a professor of computer science at the University of Maryland, where he also served for more than 6 years as director. My apologies, Mr. Subrahmanian, can you please wait a second to share your screen? Thank you very much. He previously served as a professor of computer science at the University of Maryland, where he also served for more than 6 years as director of the Institute for Advanced Computer Studies. Professor Subrahmanian was the first to use advanced machine learning techniques to develop predictive models of terrorist groups' behaviors, including Hezbollah, Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Indian Mujahideen, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, as well as models to reshape it. Professor Subrahmanian is also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. He has authored 8 books, edited 12, and published over 300 refereed articles. His work was featured in the Baltimore Sun, The Economist, Science, Nature, Washington Post, American Public Media. He also served on numerous editorial boards and on the board of director of Centimetrics, Inc., on the research advisory board of Tata Consultancy Services, and also previously on the Development Gateway Foundation, the DARPA Executive Advisory Council on Advanced Logistics, as well as an ad hoc member of the US Air Force Science Advisory Board. Dr. Subrahmanian, we feel truly privileged for your participation. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cecilia. And it was truly a pleasure to listen both to Mr. Samuel and Mr. Obasi prior to my presentation. So I'm going to be giving you a very different perspective of terrorism operations and counterterrorism operations in general. And the work I'm going to talk about is from my latest book on Boko Haram that was just published at the beginning of the year. So, and as usual, you know, in academia, we should acknowledge our collaborators and friends and co-authors, many of whom did a lot of the work, much more than me. So I'm going to talk about how we use artificial intelligence and machine learning for counterterrorism for a couple of minutes before I get into child soldiers and Boko Haram. So in general, so in the case of Boko Haram, we have data from January 2009 onwards to the current day. We learned our first predictive models on data till the end of 2016, 96 months. And of course, we have more data since then. And we've been putting out forecasts on or about the first day of every month about Boko Haram's activities over the next 6 months since January 2019. So for about 2 years now. And the goal of these forecasts and these AI models is pretty simple to express. One, obviously, if you can come up with forecasts of what kinds of activities Boko Haram will carry out, what kinds of targets they will select in the next few months, counterterrorism organizations can better allocate their resources, which are usually too little. Second, they also help us get a better understanding of some of the factors that are linked to these attacks. What are the factors that help predict whether certain attacks are happening or not? I do want to emphasize that this does not mean there's a causal link, just a correlative link. And once we get a better understanding of these factors linked to certain attacks, we can help shape policy to reduce such attacks. And we have some algorithmic approaches to that as well. But before I get into that, let me give you a 60,000-foot version of this. Everybody on this call has probably used a service like Amazon. And what we're trying to do is to be the Amazon for counterterrorism. And how do we think about the way we work with Amazon today? You, as a user who's buying something on Amazon, either use their app or their website and enter their platform. Amazon, of course, has a very detailed behavioral model of every single individual who's ever visited their website. And certainly, as the person visits more, they have more information about the person. So at the very beginning, if you're a new user to Amazon, their model of you is going to be very, very poor. But over time, it's going to improve as they gather more data, as you do more things within their platform. You ask your queries on Amazon, you perform your actions in some context over here. And what Amazon tries to do is to learn a predictive model of what you will do. They try to forecast what will you do under different conditions. What is the set of actions that you might take given a particular option that they might present you? And then based on that, they try to present you with options that maximize some objective for them, such as the probability of making a sale, such as the expected revenue. They're controlling a lot, but in fact, of course, they control what they order, but in fact, a lot of the data is controlled by Amazon. We can think about this in exactly the same way in the context of counterterrorism. I've taken exactly the same picture I had on the previous slide and mapped it into a counterterrorism setting as follows. You don't have the user, but you have a terrorist group over here. Boko Haram is one such example. Rather than the Amazon website or the app, you have a counterterrorism analytics platform, such as one that we've been building for many years. And at any point in time, you have a behavioral model of a terrorist group. And intuitively, what that model says is, what are the conditions under which the group takes certain actions? What are the conditions in the environment under which the group takes this action versus that action? Or perhaps no action is also an action. And so using this model, it's possible to look at a current set of circumstances, such as the situation Boko Haram is in today, and make some predictions and forecasts about what they may do next month or over the next quarter or over the next 6 months. Once you have that in place, you can come up with some policy recommendations that try to reshape those outcomes. If you don't like what the forecasts are saying, the model should be able to tell you what you can do to reshape those outcomes to the extent this is possible. And of course, there are many challenges in this. So this is sort of the overall model that we're following. At this point, since 2019, we've been putting out forecasts for 12 types of attacks carried out by Boko Haram. I won't go through all the details, but I'm happy to talk one-on-one with anybody who'd like to contact me. But the idea is the following. We have two kinds of forecasting models. Models that actually generate the forecast of what's happening, and models that explain what those forecasts, what they're based on. I'm going to talk more about the latter. But again, I just want to mention that if anybody wants to add themselves to our list of Boko Haram recipients of our forecast, all you have to do is to send an email to the address listed below, bh.monthly.analysis.reports@gmail. So what do our explanatory models look like? They're very, very simple, and I'll give you several examples of them in a few minutes. The idea is pretty simple. We look at the environment in which Boko Haram is functioning, and we say if some conditions are true in that environment in a given month, M, then Boko Haram will carry out an attack or not carry out an attack, depending on whether this is plus or minus, a certain number of months later, all right? For a rule to be good, we try to predict these kinds of attacks for several kinds of attacks, 1 to 6 months ahead. That is, the delta here is, can we predict today what will happen in the next month, or in sometime in the next 2 months, or sometime in the next 6 months? There's a bunch of statistical properties that these rules have to satisfy to be good, but the easiest way for me, I'll get into those with some sample rules in a couple of minutes. But I want to say a little bit about our findings. The single biggest factor we found that is linked to not just one kind of attack, but the different kinds of attacks that are carried out is the recruitment, training, and deployment of children, all right? Which is this variable over here. It is the most important variable which appears and helps and is linked, I should say, to various kinds of attacks, including suicide bombings. We've heard about that from Mr. Obasi, as well as Mr. Samuel, sexual violence, abduction, arson, as well as attempted bombings, bombings that were attempted but did not succeed. As Mr. Obasi mentioned a few minutes back, the large majority of child-backed suicide bombings occurred in the 2014 through 17 or so timeframe, but there have been episodes since then. And I wanted to just take one example of an attack that happened in the northern part of Cameroon near the Lake Chad region in August last year, the very beginning of August. And about 17 or more people were killed, not including the suicide bomber themselves. And these are some of the predictions we put out previously about suicide bombings. Now, our group, we did not have a variable to capture suicide bombings using children as the vector of the attack. But on February 29th, looking 6 months ahead, we predicted a 96.3% probability of a suicide bombing. On July 31, one day before the bombing actually occurred, we predicted a 62% probability that it would happen that month. But what you'll notice here is that though the numbers fluctuate in some cases in the 90s, 70s, 80s, 60s, they're all well above 50% and consistently so, which would give you greater confidence that this is going to happen. And as a counterterrorism person, you can plan for this. Let's take a look at some of the kinds of rules that we learned from the data. So when Boko Haram is recruiting, training, and deploying young individuals, our models show that there's a 79% probability when they're actively doing it in a given month and when they're reportedly doing it in a given month, they will carry out suicide bombings in the next month with 79% probability. So what is this statistic? It simply says, look at the set of all months for which you've got data and find all the months in which Boko Haram was actively reported as recruiting, training, and or deploying young individuals. I do want to emphasize the use of the word reported. I should have put it on my slide, but I didn't. But my lab does not actually interview subjects like Mr. Samuel and perhaps Mr. Obasi and others might do. So we rely on the reporting from the works that you and others have done on the ground. So this says that the conditional probability that if we look at months in which this condition is true, recruitment, training, and children is happening actively, the probability of a suicide bombing in the next month is 79%. So you can think of this if condition here as a beacon. When the beacon is turned on, there's a 79% probability that suicide bombings will follow the next month. But this number here says when the beacon is turned off, that is, this is not true, there's only a 25% probability of a suicide bombing the next month. So that means that there's a huge difference between 79 and 25%. And intuitively, to predict whether, in a very simplistic way, to predict whether Boko Haram will carry out a suicide bombing next month, you look and say, is this condition true this month? If it is, there's a high chance they will. If it is not, then there's not a huge chance, but still some chance that they will. And that's sort of a very simple 1-minute explanation of how we use very simple machine learning here. There's much more complicated stuff that goes into our models, but this is sort of the essence of it. And there's another thing to remember, which also is an important statistic. And that is, somebody might turn around and say, well, Boko Haram carries out lots of suicide bombings. So even without this condition, there's some probability that Boko Haram is going to carry out suicide bombings next month, regardless of whether this is true or not. So another metric we use is called lift. And that says this particular condition increases that base probability by 78%. So if this lift number is greater than 1, that means this precondition, the if precondition, is generating additional value over and above the unconditioned probability that somebody will carry out, that Boko Haram carries out suicide bombings in a given month. All right. So this is a very important value, and 178 means that it's almost 78% higher. There are some other metrics that I won't get into. We also derive conditions for when Boko Haram does not carry out certain kinds of attacks. And again, I just want to emphasize, related to the previous slide, is the fact that when Boko Haram is not in a given month reported as recruiting, training, or deploying youngsters, the probability that they will not carry out suicide bombings in the next month is again 75%, very high. All right. And so that tells you, these two rules that you just see in these two slides sort of tells you this close connection between suicide bombings in future months, not now, and recruitment and training of Boko Haram, of young individuals by Boko Haram in preceding months. By the way, this is a 4-month delay, not a 1-month delay as in the previous condition. Likewise, when Boko Haram is not engaged in training, recruiting, or deploying young individuals, the following month, there's a the chances that they will not carry out sexual violence is also pretty high, all right? So that means that when they're not engaged in this process, sexual violence the next month is likely to be much lower probability, all right? And child soldiers are also linked to future abductions. Again, I want to emphasize the temporal nature of this. We're not talking, when we're saying when this is true this month, in the next month, there will not be sexual violence. But Boko Haram is linked through more complex rules to abductions in the future. So recruitment training of child soldiers in a given month alone is not linked to future abductions, at least in the data we have. But in conjunction with the kinds of statements they put out, the probability that they'll carry out abductions 1 month later is pretty high, okay, 65. Whereas when either of these two preconditions, the recruitment training and the not making public statements demanding religious rule in a given month, when either of these two things is false, the probability drops from 65 to 16%, almost a 50% drop. And again, the lift is pretty high. So that means that this rule adds value. So I'm going to sort of put out tell you what our forecasts are for the next 6 months. These are our April 1st forecasts that were released on April 1st. So they're still applicable because they go for 6 months, but we'll be putting out a fresh set of forecasts on May 1st, in a couple of days, literally. And what you can see is forecasts for the April to June timeframe are abductions, arsons, etc. The 12 actions, there are 7 or 8 on this and a few on the next slide. But for all the types of attacks we consider, except targeting civilians for their beliefs, which is about 50-50, we're not sure. And, and attempted bombings, which is 58% probability, according to our models. But every other kind of attack we would expect to happen in the April, May, June timeframe of this year. If we look further at the April to August timeframe and say which of these will happen sometime in the next 6 months, the attempted bombings go up from 58.8 to 86%. Everything else is pretty high still. And the targeting civilians for their beliefs goes up from 52 to 76%. But notice that this forecast here on this right-hand column comes at the expense of some temporal fine-grained predictions. So what we're doing is we're saying, well, we can't, for predicting whether it'll happen sometime in the 3 months starting in April, we're able to say 50-50, more or less. 52.4% is basically 50%, more or less. But if we give you a less focused forecast and say sometime in the next 6 months, we're far more sure it's going to happen. 52 goes up to 76. So to conclude, I'd like to say a few things. First, Boko Haram's recruitment and training of children is, even if a counterterrorism person says, well, our first goal is to defang the group and reduce its operational efficiency and lethality. And, what our models show is that recruitment and training of children is linked in a very, very essential way to the lethality of the group, regardless of, for many of the major attacks carried out by the group. I talked briefly today about suicide bombing, sexual violence, and abduction. I didn't discuss arson, and I didn't discuss attempted bombings either, but we have results on those as well. And so it's the policy we came up with, which is sort of course, like all policies, not guaranteed to work by any means, but is the best that our models tell us is our best option. The first thing it does is to say we must cut down on the recruitment of children by Boko Haram. So we generated several policies, of which one was the one we were happiest with. Again, I'd be happy to talk to people about that, but to cut down Boko Haram's lethality, we must cut down on recruitment of children by Boko Haram. Of course, in addition, there is the ethical and humanitarian aspect of this. I think all of us on this call today agree that, the use of child soldiers in any setting is absolutely despicable and repugnant, and of course, illegal from the point of view of international law as well. Thank you so much.
Dr. Subrahmanian, thank you very much for sharing with us and with our audiences such a fascinating and remarkable work. It's with great pleasure that I now introduce our last speaker, Achaleke Christian. Achaleke is a development, peacebuilding, and CVE expert with 14 years of experience working as a practitioner, researcher, and currently serving as the executive director of Local Youth Corner Cameroon, a youth-led peacebuilding organization. Christian has developed from a community actor to a global expert and consultant, leading the design and implementation of over 500 projects, and ultimately impacted the lives of over 1 million young people across the world. Christian has engaged in the development of several youth development, peace-related publications, and policy recommendations, including the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2250 and 4 youth-led evidence-based publications related to peacebuilding and development in Cameroon. He is a part-time lecturer at the University of Buea in Cameroon and also serves on the advisory board of the International Institute of Justice and the Rule of Law at the University of Malta, as a youth advisory committee member for the Knowledge for Prevention project at the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security. Among his several recognitions, his response to COVID-19 was named the best youth response by the Cameroon government and the United Nations system in Cameroon. He was awarded the Premio Mundo Negro La Fraternidad, the Luxembourg Peace Prize, recognized among 35 Chevening change makers and featured among 100 most influential young Africans. In 2016, Christian was also named the most influential young Cameroonian, recognized by the Commonwealth as the Commonwealth Young Person of the Year and winner of the Commonwealth Youth Award of Excellence in Development Work, where he was received by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II of England. Thank you warmly, Achaleke, for joining us today. You may start at any time.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, and it's a pleasure to join. And I've been following very closely. And I think the predictive model and everything which has been shared is very, very exciting for me and learning. And, you know, joining this conversation, firstly, because conversations around children and conflict and violence is very personal to me. Growing up in a community where it was something that I lived, you know, on hand, and I could understand what it takes, the nexus between all the thin line between a child, an adolescent, or a young person, you know, involved in violence, and you know how it looked like. And now working in the space of counter-violent extremism, where you know we've had the opportunity to be more of a practice on the field, designing program to respond to some of these challenges. I think that it has really been an opportunity to share perspective. And I think that the previous speakers before me have shared these experiences. I've had the opportunity to work across the Lake Chad Basin. I worked in Maiduguri, so I mean, my perspective is kind of shared with, you know, Lake Chad Basin and other countries where I've had the opportunity to work, and of course, Cameroon specifically, where after seeing all of these, you know, the biggest thing, which the wish was, is to see how we can be able to provide a response to this as young people. I mean, just to remind that the context of Boko Haram in the northern part of Cameroon, children are, you know, much more exposed and vulnerable. You know, they are very docile and they are malleable. You could change them to whatsoever. Now, this is coming in a context where problem solving, dialogue, and other forms of peace building, because of its patriarchal nature, it's already been consumed because of the nature of the way these communities are, making it very difficult for these children to be prevented even by their parents, because in that context, children and parents do not have the opportunity to really share perspective, and parents sometimes do not have the luxury of the time to observe the children and see a change. And you would bear with me that the radicalization process, the recruitment process, especially the ones which are not forceful per se, where they abduct people, takes a process, and sometimes, you know, parents miss out, and that's what it takes them to where they are. I've had the opportunity to meet with several of such children who have been at the crossroad, and they are young. They might not be able to articulate their perspectives very well, but one of the things which is peculiar is they call the system the Amajiri system, which is a form of education in, you know, in these communities where a child is taken to a Muslim scholar and that child stays there and get the most of, you know, Quranic education. Now, what we realize, just like in Nigeria, where I spent time, is that Boko Haram sees such community as a perfect place to recruit, because these children beg for people and they come back in the evening and they come and sleep and they are taught some verses of the Quran. That's it. Now, this is where some of those preachers will use purported preaching to radicalize find themselves. Some of them are there. And you see, it's a perfect ground for these children to have, a proper feeding of these rhetorics. At the same time, we had evidence of children who left to go and beg and never return, and they were either taken forcefully or something happened. And we realized that, speaking to one of the malams who was in charge of this facility, he shared an experience of how, his facility, about 3 of his children have been involved in suicide bomb who were recruited. So it was a real-time thing. Let me go to where you have light so you could properly see me, maybe. Is that okay? Okay. Just a moment. Okay. Yes. Okay. So as I was saying, this is what we noticed. And this lifestyle, I would call it, the Amajiri system is a lifestyle which is respected, it's culture that became a trend. And in Northeast Nigeria, it's the same thing. In Niger, it's the same context that we are seeing, where these groups recruit from this spaces or recruit children who have been part of the spaces. And of course, the whole perspective of recruiting from schools has been shared and all of that. But Cecile, I think what's more interesting is how do we respond to these challenges? It was very unfortunate to realize that despite how precarious this situation is in this region, many response which were humanitarian-led, focus on providing food, providing clothes, providing where to sleep, and really miss some key aspects which are very necessary for these children, which is firstly giving them back their childhood. Now, to prevent them, it's about making their childhood more inspiring. They are in a context where poverty is very high. They're in a context where to communicate with your peer is very challenging. They are in a war-torn context where the luxury of riding a bicycle or having fun is not given to them, making them much more liable to recruitment and vulnerable to recruitment. And this is the kind of context that we saw. Now, in our response, after visiting several of these contexts, and we realized that Boko Haram is hating on Western education, not just because they just want to hate on Western education, but because though the claim that Western education has been able to bring corruption and other vices which are challenging their perspective of hegemony, at the same time, education has that capacity of preventing a child from being radicalized and recruited. It has the capacity of guaranteeing a child's future. And that's why schools have been targeted. And our response was, how do we give back the childhood of these children by reflecting on ways to educate them, which prevents them from radicalization, which give them an opportunity to dialogue among themselves, an opportunity to look at life differently and to hope. Because in their recruitment strategy, they take away your opportunities to hope. And that's why young girls will be raped at several instances to destroy them and make them feel they are not valuable. That's why children will be forced to kill their parents as a way to radicalize them. But in this case, our approach is, how do we make this difference? How do we make them value their lives to an extent where they see carrying an arm to be, a negative thing? Yes, they are children. Perspective might be they might not be able to decide what is right or wrong. But trust me, from my experience, we've seen that it is possible to engage them. Now, I want to share with you a positive practice because to me, as a young person and as a peace builder and working on CBE, my perspective is around what can be done and what can work and what we've been able to do, which is working. So when we noticed this, we developed a program called the Salam Initiative. So the Salam Initiative, it's a program where we focus on providing formal and non-formal education for children, not in a school setting, very informal setting, but processes which we are able to solve their personal problems. We are able to make them understand that they can solve their own problems because a lot of them have lost their parents, a lot of them have been displaced and they go to a different place. So we are piloting this in Mora, where we started with 120 children, now we have 150. And what we do is that we design a kind of a school program which is out of the normal school program because people are not going to school. Schools have been attacked and all of that, and they are frightened to go to school. We come into these Amajiri spaces, this Quranic kind of schools, and we are able to redesign. We rather bring them an alternative of learning. And our perspective is first youth-led. And that's what makes us, innovative and special in the sense that we connect with them. We are young people speaking to children, and some of them who are adolescents and definitely should be getting into, the youthful age. And our approach has been very successful because when we did an initial monitoring and evaluation of these kids, trust me, they were devastated. A lot of them could not physically communicate with someone because they have either lost their parents or their parents were killed in front of them, which rather make them more vulnerable to radicalization. When we spoke to a lot of them, they wanted to join the army. Why? Because they wanted to pay back. Then we asked ourselves, if children at this age are growing with the spirit of revenge or avenging, where are we going to? But these are critical aspects which sometimes responses are ignoring. Whereas, I always say this perspective, 1,000 times zero is zero. No matter how much humanitarian support we give or sending them to school, well, we have not been able to respond to psychosocial, mental health related issues, self-esteem, we fail. Now, in a process, we respond to all of these aspects. When we started, the local authorities were like, it's not possible, guys. No one has been able to do this. But we told them we are young people, we can do. We don't have a classroom. We started with an empty space. I remember how we started this process. I traveled to the US for a meeting, and the money I was able to make, I went to a Dollar Tree and purchased, articles for $1. And I bought a whole 2 suitcases. And I came back home and I said, we had to start this. I think responding to these problems, we need to be very humanist in all of these, and situations where political and even international organizations see it as an opportunity, not just to solve the problem, but to respond to it at a superficial level. And we were able to start this process, and we grew from one stage to another. As we speak, the community, seeing this transformation, were able to help us to build a grass cache, because we didn't have to wait for a classroom to be there to do this kind of work. And that's why we have a challenge. And these kids are there. A year goes by, the second year goes by, they become much more vulnerable because they have nothing to do. They have to beg, and they are recruited on their way going to beg in markets. Now, we have been working with them. We initiated, learning processes. Some who could not read and write. We have about 50% now that can be able to read and write. We have about 80% whom, we speak to see their perspective around paying back. And they are saying, no, I cannot pay back because I want to become a doctor. I want to become a teacher. I want to become a lawyer. Some now can now ride bicycles. They can now sing music. And in 2019, we had their end of year party, and we could see them dancing. We could see them happy, meaning something is being done. Now, in 2020, we had the first cohort of those that we could guarantee that we've been able to transform them. And now we're putting them into formal school because our process is re-educating and putting them into formal school. And in Mora, we have basically one state-owned formal school. We're able to mobilize, resources to pay their school fees and get bags. And trust me, in the school where they went to, 10 of these children were among the best students of that school. To us, that's the kind of joy, and responding to this vulnerability of children, building their self-esteem. Because in the context of far north, in northeast Nigeria, a lot of children do not feel that they can even succeed at life. And that's why it's easy for rhetoric to really get into their minds. A lot of them feel that, they are broke, or they are suffering, or they cannot have food to eat because of, it's not possible to succeed. But this is where we came from a more, preventing as well as trying to counter what they have been going through. So, Cecilia, this is the kind of perspective of what we have been seeing. And from a more positive perspective, I feel that it is very possible for us to respond. So many of the recommendations we're giving, which I properly buy to this recommendation, I think the work is done in the field. While we have the policy, we have the laws that have been initiated, it is very important we use innovative approaches to respond to some of this, because it is working. And in Northeast Nigeria, Nnamdi, talked about certain examples of what is working. They are similar of this initiative. And when it's coming from young people, our peers who are younger than us really connect, because sometimes they'll ask themselves, why should I join where someone like you is not joining? If you're coming to talk to me about peace, it means I need to think differently. And as they grow, it becomes a culture. And we feel that this conversation of children is very relevant, even for those who have not been recruited today. In 10 years' time, they can be recruited as young as youth or adults. It is possible that we plant this seed of dialoguing, this seed of forgiveness, this seed of tolerance into these children as a way to prevent, their recruitment of further use into these armed groups or Boko Haram. I mean, Cecilia, these are the kind of perspectives which I wanted to share on. And as I said, on a very positive note, because sometimes the sad news are really, really overwhelming. We get them every day. And we feel that while we are complaining, while we are talking about the problem, just like Prof shared on how AI can work, I feel that responding with key actions like these are very important. But unfortunately, resources for this are very limited. I always say the price of a Kalashnikov, which I know of, but CT is not paying off. We need to respond with innovation, technology, and I think that's the future. Thank you very much, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Achaleke, for your remarkable insights. I would like now to use the last 15 minutes of this live briefing to open the floor for question and answer. I would like by a first question regarding gender-based violence. Gender-based violence and the targeting of women has been documented as a significant development in Boko Haram's tactics in 2013. And some studies indicate that gender-based violence in Boko Haram transcend region, religion, ethnicity, with physical and sexual abuse affecting as many as 35.1% of Igbo women and 34.3% of Hausa Fulani women. Boko Haram has, since 2010, modeled its attacks on Al-Qaeda, with whom Shekau had developed links, but also with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Hakim, and also Al-Shabaab, as we know most recently, ISIL. However, the gender dimension of Boko Haram's exploitation of women and girls, and particularly in suicide bombings operation, has been uncharacteristic to other terrorist organizations with whom Boko Haram claims ties. I would really much appreciate your thoughts. Thank you for the one who answers. Mr. Obasi, would you like to answer this question? You were mentioning before the gender dimension of Boko Haram exploitation, and particularly with regarding suicide bombings.
Yes, I didn't quite get the question.
The question regards how is the gender dimension of Boko Haram that is mirrored, particularly in the exploitation of women and girls in suicide bombing operation, differing from other terrorist organizations with whom Boko Haram claims to have ties, and why do you think it would be so?
Well, first of all, I agree on the premise that Boko Haram has used more girls and suicide bombings than any other organization that we know about. In that case, it's been very, an extremely violating of gender rights more than any other organization that we can think of in terms of the sexual dimension. Exactly why it does that, I'm not in a position to know. I can't say exactly. Perhaps maybe Malik may have an idea, but I don't quite think.
Hello?
Yes, Malik.
Hello?
Go ahead. Yes, Malik.
Okay. Well, I think Obasi, I agree with Obasi. It's difficult to actually tell why this is so, why it is different from other groups, particularly the use of the gender dynamics, especially deploying women for suicide bombing. But I think it speaks to the brutality of Abubakar Shekau, because why? So this, I don't think this has anything to do with religion, with their ideology, because when you look at the split in 2016, this is one of the reasons given, the use of women, you know. So and ISWAP, on the other hand, does not use women. It doesn't use women for combat role and order. It just Shekau. So I don't think it has anything. It's about the personality. If you take out Shekau today, maybe another leader comes in, it may be different. Maybe say, okay, we don't use women, we don't exploit women this way. So I think it's about the personality of who the leader is.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Cecilia?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a conversation which I would like to, throw a little perspective on, considering that when the whole issue of Chibok girls, happened, and I was speaking in this women's meeting, and I was talking about a shift in violent extremist, terrorist groups' perspective of, the gender empowerment dynamics within terrorism. Now, they are seemingly wanting to empower women more, within their perspective. And this, let me explain. Women have a soft spot within the society to an extent where, especially in a context, if someone sees a woman, dressed, even carried a suicide vest, the probability of the person even thinking the woman's suicide bomber is very slim. And it's almost the same reason why they use children, because it's a soft spot. And it is very, very easy for them to go through even security checks with bombs, because other things do interplay. I think that's a key thing that we've seen. I've spoken to a lot of women in this context to really understand what is going on and why should they be used. It's not happening only in Northeast Niger. It's happening in Cameroon. It's the same thing, where women are being used. And in most of the instances where women even walk through markets before exploding, a lot of people could not think about. Now, in Cameroon, the Kanuri men, when you see them, a Kanuri man is already stigmatized to be a Boko Haram, but it's not the case of a woman. You get the point? So it's a kind of a shift for them to properly achieve, their perspective. And if you look at the role of a woman in a typical context where we find them ourselves, they are very strategic, they're very important. So I think that's one thing. And when it comes to recruitment as well, the whole gender dynamics of recruitment, it's much more easier for a woman to recruit a man into an armed group than for a man to recruit a man. It's much more easier. And we are seeing that ISIS uses the same model. So I feel that, this perspective is not just about the personality of Shekau from a perspective, Nigeria, Cameroon, and within Chad and others. I think it's an understanding of how important a woman is and trying to use that to be able to inflict pain. And that's what we are seeing. Just like a child is very innocent, it's flawless. And the build on that, because you see a child and you will not think of the child carrying a vest. I mean, that's the context that we are having. And it is continuing because it is working. We are seeing a lot of that happening. So I think this gender dynamic is very important. And coming back to how stakeholders who work around women, peace and security, work around, women empowerment, also need to re-strategize, because these guys are not letting things loose. They are coming with innovation and they are ready for the game. And we need to be much more radical in trying to be able to prevent or protect such groups of people in this conversation, just like young people. They are using us a lot because we have a lot of energy, we have a lot of wisdom to do great things, and our energy is used strongly. I think that's the perspective that we are seeing from what I've been able to learn from research and from practice which I've been able to get so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Achaleke, and also Nnamdi and Malik. There is another question from the chat. Since late March, there have been reports of increasing numbers of people deserting Boko Haram, including at least 2,400 cases in Chad, 1,000 cases in Nigeria, 584 in Cameroon, and 243 in Niger. What does this mean for the future of the group? And also, can we consider this as a progressive disillusionment with Boko Haram that may lead to future positive outcomes for peace and stability? Or do you consider that these defectors would instead just join other criminal networks? Yes, Malik, please.
I think this question directly speaks to the report recently launched by the Institute for Security Studies, which looks at managing the journey out of Boko Haram, managing the journey out of violent extremism in the region. There are lots of stuff that the report looked at. What informed this defection? You know, a lot of reasons. You had disillusionment. You had the military operations. You have the living conditions within the group and a whole lot. All this led to defection. But when you look, talking about the future of these guys, whether it will contribute to peace in the region or they will end up in other criminal gangs. So this has to do with how, regionally, how we manage these desertions, these defections from this group. Why are these people leaving? So if they come out, what are their expectations in leaving this group? So when they come out, are these expectations met? If these expectations are not met, so what happens? So they have to look for alternatives. We're already seeing that in relation to what is happening in the Northwest and the North Central. That's I'm talking about the crisis there, the banditry, the so-called banditry. Research is showing that some of these defectors are teaming up with some of these criminal gangs in the region. You know, so that shows that there's a there's a lot of work to do in managing this situation.
Just to comment a bit there, the decisions we have, also heard about, but I must say that it's a subject on which there is very little light as at the moment. We've had a case, we've had cases in the past when people deserted. They didn't go to the government's Operation Safe Corridor program that is supposed to process deserters. They quietly went away and maybe relocated to other parts of the country, some in Kano, some in Lagos, in other cities. And because they realized that if they show up and self-identify, they will be arrested immediately. They operate, very discreetly. So we don't really know clearly the scale of the defections and how much that affects Boko Haram or future or not. But we are also concerned, as Malik has highlighted, about the fact that some of these, the deserters may not go the way of the earlier ones, as I said, who went to Lagos, went to Kano, started trades and tried to stay under the radar. Some are actually moving to the Northwest and lending their skills and their knowledge to the armed groups, in the Northwest. And that is something very worrying, not only from a criminal violence point of view, but from an extremist violence point of view, that we may be having a spillover of some of the violence in the Northeast now shifting, to the Northwest. Already we have evidence of both transactional and tactical relationships between groups at both ends of the country. And there are concerns that this could get worse as time goes on. So it's something that really needs much closer watch and much more research.
Thank you very much, Nnamdi and Malik as well. I would like now to address a question to Dr. Subrahmanian. In the past, you have developed social network analysis models to predict the rise of terrorist group leaders before it happens. Do your models have the ability to predict the beginning of recruitment of children or only their employment once it started?
So thank you, Cecilia. That's an excellent question. So I think we are only now starting to think about that particular question that Mr. Watkins raised in the chat. So in the case of Boko Haram, of course, the idea of recruiting children to work for them and fight their battles and serve in various capacities has been around for a while. So it's sort of fait accompli at this point. But we are interested in predicting a number of related questions, such as can we predict the locations that are most at risk at a very fine-grained level, So, that's one. Second, given a limited set, given those predictions, assuming we can make them, and given some limited assets to protect schools, what is the best strategy to deploy them so that we protect as many kids as possible? Those are two questions we're looking at. I think somebody also earlier in the conversation today mentioned, what might happen if some of the current leaders of Boko Haram were replaced by others. So that's also a question we're very interested in looking at. We've done that not with Boko Haram, but with data around Al-Qaeda, ISIS in general, and Hezbollah. And I think Boko Haram would be a good next group to look at for that. So we do have the algorithms for that. We do have the models for that. What we don't have right now in the form we need it is the data. So I think those are some of the questions we're really, really interested in looking at. And I think, again, to Mr. Watkins's question, in terms of other groups, which are not currently using child soldiers in a very major way, looking at predicting when they might decide to move to that strategy is a very interesting question. But I don't think we're about to take that one on just yet, because for that, we're going to have to collect a lot of data about a lot of different groups. And, it's easier to make a difference when you are focused a little more. But again, if somebody does have some data that's pertinent to that, I'd love to look at it. But great question, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Subrahmanian. As I see that the time at our avail has almost come to an end, I would like to thank our speaker for their exceptional contribution to this discussion. And thank you also for our audiences for having kindly assisted.
Thanks, Cecilia. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, audience.
Thank you very much.